pleasing sacrifices, purge your soul of all its vices, quam bonum et quam iucundum, habitare fratres in unum. Domini visiteragite, spiri vigilate, sate in fide, mari literagite, omnes confortare. Seven times a day I praise thee, I have loved like a man that raised me. Let my prayer come near thy sight, lead my heart in the way of right. In manus tuas Domine, commendo spiritum meum. In manus tuas Domine, commendo spiritum meum. Redemisti nos Domine, Deus veritatis, commendo spiritum meum. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto. In manus tuas Domine, commendo spiritum meum. Vigilate, state in fide, viri literagite, et confortamini. From the curse of our desolation, in our work we must find salvation. Remember, man, that thou art dust. In the yoke of the cross we trust. Viri literagite, vigilate, state in fide, viri literagite, et confortamini. The world's pattern is our undoing. Be reformed in your minds renewing. Holy writ the scholar's plume. Ignorance of the law is doom.
Fratres sobrius tote et vigilate, qui adversarius fester diabolus tamquam leo rugiens circuit querens quem devoret, cui resistite fortes in fide, tu autem Domine miserere nobis.
Deo gratias. Vigilate, state in fide, virilite agite, et confortamini. Stabat mater dolorosa, juxta crucem lacrimosa, dum pendebat filius, et transivit gladius. Virilite agite, vigilate, state in fide, virilite agite, et confortamini. Stand in faith with deep conviction, love thy brethren, endure affliction. In your scabbard keep your sword, holy soldiers of the Lord.
Deum laudamus,
Te Dominum confitemus, Te eternum Patrem, omnistera veneratum, Te ergo que sumus suis famulus superi, Postretios o sanguinere nemisti, eterna fac, sanctis tuis in gloria numerari, salvum fac ocultum Domine, et benedicere aetati Tue, et rege eos, et extole illos, usque in aeternum, in Te Domine speravi, non confundam in Virilite agite, vigilate, state in fide, virilite agite, et confortamini. Prayer cease sing sacrifices. Purge your soul of all its vices. Quam bonum et quam iucundum, habitare fratres inunum. Domini visiterat te, spiri vigilate, satem fide, mariterat te, omnes confortae. 7 times a day I praise thee. I have loved thy commands that raised me. Let my prayer come near thy sight. Lead my heart in the way of right.
In manus tuas Domine, commendo spiritum meum.
In manus tuas Domine, commendo spiritum meum.
Redemisti nos Domine, Deus veritatis.
Commendo spiritum meum.
Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto.
In manus tuas Domine, commendo spiritum meum.
So if you want at some point, just when we get our first couple of bits.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Orthodox Logos. Today, we are going to be presenting our new podcast called The Road to Paradise. This is episode 2. I figured we'd go ahead and put them on this YouTube channel and kind of keep everything in the same family. My name is Ian Silver. I'm here with my co-host, Nathaniel Harmon.
Greetings.
And today we will be discussing the Farmer Giles of Ham, forgive me, and What's Wrong with the World, Tolkien and the Social Order.
So it seems to me that if we're going to discuss Farmer Giles of Ham, we first need to know where on earth this place is and what it's all about. So Ian, what can you tell us of the history of the Little Kingdom?
The history of the Little Kingdom, few fragments have survived, but by chance, an account of its origin has been preserved, a legend, perhaps rather than an account. For it is evidently a late compilation full of marvels, derived not from sober annals, but from the popular lays to which its author frequently refers. For him, the events that he records lay already in a distant past, but he seems, nonetheless, to have lived himself in the lands of the Little Kingdom. Such geographical knowledge as he shows, it is not his strong point, mind you, is of that country, while of regions outside it, north or west, he is plainly ignorant. An excuse for presenting a translation of this curious tale out of its very insular Latin into the modern tongue of the United Kingdom may be found in the glimpse that it affords of life in a dark period of the history of Britain. Not to mention the light that it throws on the origin of some difficult place names. Some may find the character and adventures of its hero attractive in themselves. The boundaries of the little kingdom, either in time or space, are not easy to determine from the scanty evidence. Since Brutus came to Britain, many kings and realms have come and gone. The partition under Lochran, Camber, Albanac was only the first of many shifting divisions. What with love of petty independence on the one hand, and on the other the greed of kings for wider realms, the years were filled with swift alternations of war and peace, of mirth and woe, as historians of the reign of Arthur tell us. A time of unsettled frontiers, when men might rise or fall suddenly, and songwriters had abundant material and eager audiences. Somewhere in those long years, after the days of King Cole, maybe, but before Arthur or the seven kingdoms of the English, we must place the events here related. And there seen is the valley of the Thames, with an excursion northwest to the walls of Wales.
The Valley of the Thames to Wales. That sounds like fun.
We must place the events here related.
So, Ian, this, if my memory is correct, this is the first time that you have ever read this particular book. Yeah?
Yes, it is.
So, what can you tell us about it?
Well, there's a lot of interesting factors that this short story by Tolkien bring up. And I think one of the most interesting things would be the lack of tradition and the broken hierarchy that we see from the very beginning. And maybe we can touch on what exactly we mean by that as far as the tradition that's broken.
Well, the answer to that is yes, all of the traditions are broken, but we'll get into that, I suppose, when we discuss the general synopsis. But more or less, for anyone who's never read this story, what happens is there's the little kingdom in the middle of the UK, right? So it's, and this happens many, many years ago. And a giant decides to go wandering off from Wales, because as everyone knows, that's where giants live, because Wales is a particularly wild and untamed country. So this giant goes wandering off, and he finds himself late at night in the Middle Kingdom. And the outcome of that is that he trespasses on the property of Farmer Giles, who doesn't take very kindly to that. And because this is a short story that Tolkien wrote, there are some anachronisms in there. One of them being that Farmer Giles, living in the mid-4th century AD, has a blunderbuss.
A blunderbuss is what exactly, for our listeners that have never heard that term? And I hadn't heard this term before yesterday. So
it's a flintlock or matchlock archaic style of shotgun that you can put pretty much anything in. If you can force a rock down the barrel, you can shoot a rock.
And we find him stuffing what?
Nails, detritus, wire, all kinds of unpleasant things in there. So he does this, and he goes out and he shoots the giant in the face. And the giant, who is rather blind and stupid, thinks that he's stumbled into a nest of monstrous dragonflies that have stung him, and he decides he doesn't like that, so he grabs a couple of sheep from Farmer Giles and goes back home.
He also squashes...
He also kills Farmer Giles' favorite cow, although this seems to be...
Galathea, I believe, is her name.
Although this seems to be purely accidental. However, as the story progresses, what happens is rumors are spread, specifically by Farmer Giles' dog, who is a talking dog, but rather poorly educated because he can only speak the vulgar language. He can't actually speak dog Latin, which is quite the indictment against his character.
And his name is
learning.
His name is Garm. He enjoys moonshine and rabbits.
That is correct.
As well.
So Garm spreads all these rumors about what actually happened, and Giles begins to believe them himself, to the point where the king begins to take note of some of these rumors, and he thinks, well, it's nice that the valor of our folk is not yet dead, and that in the little village of Ham there are still some men who are great men. And he sends Farmer Giles a sword and a letter saying that he's very pleased, to have such a man in his service. And
he sends him a belt as well, right?
Right.
And the letter has a seal on it. It's a very royal
Mm-hmm.
looking letter.
So, moving very, very quickly, just for the sake of the synopsis. Eventually, when this giant gets back home, and this all takes place obviously roughly contemporaneously, when the giant gets home, he starts telling other people, other monsters, other dragons, and other giants about this wonderful land out to the southeast.
The land of milk and honey.
More or less, yeah. There's sheep for the taking. There are no knights. There's nothing to get in the way. And so, eventually, one of these dragons decides, I'm feeling kind of lucky. I'm going to go down here and check this place out because the Wales has been kind of scarce these days. He's getting kind of thin. So he goes to the Middle Kingdom and does what dragons do. He burns down villages, he eats some of the people, he eats all their livestock, and generally makes a nuisance of himself.
Destroys the forest.
Right. Just tears things up. He does what monsters do. And the king can't be bothered to do anything about this, despite the fact that he's one of the first people who hears that there's a dragon that's come out of the mountains. And
that's where we see, one of the issues with the hierarchs.
Right. He does nothing. And eventually, the citizens of Ham, when the dragon gets particularly close, decides that they decide that, okay, well, Farmer Giles, who is our brave hero, he needs to go do something about this. So they kind of bully him, although he's not entirely guiltless in this either, because he's accepted a reputation that is not necessarily deserved.
Yeah, you have the miller.
Right, the blacksmith and the
blacksmith
parson.
And the parson. And for people who don't know what a parson is, a parson, for lack of better terms, would be
just a
pastor
preacher,
or priest.
A village preacher.
Yeah.
So they kind of bully Farmer Giles into going to face this dragon, which he does, and he captures the dragon effectively because the hierarchy is so broken at this point that neither dragon nor farmer know what they're supposed to do with each other. And
yeah, we see that dragons don't even believe that knights really exist anymore.
Right.
And knights also, haven't seen dragons in, who knows how long.
Dragons have become kind of a joke. So at this point, the dragon bargains for his life and effectively tells the citizens of Ham, which is where Giles brings him after he's captured the dragon, that, okay, well, I'll pay you guys a ransom. I've got a lot of treasure back in my cave. I'll go pay the ransom for you.
Yeah, he likes to make a lot of promises.
Right. As monsters do.
And he's a dragon with, absolutely no conscience at all and just saying whatever he can. He's being sly.
He's trying to save himself, and he doesn't particularly care how much he damns himself in doing so. So he does this, and then he leaves. Well, the king finds out that this deal has been struck where the dragon's going to bring most of its wealth back.
So now he decides to show up.
So he shows up with all his knights, and they sit there and they effectively eat the entire village out of Hearth-and-Home. And
they drink all the ale as well,
which is a terrible sin. And when the dragon doesn't show up when he's promised to, which is on the feast of Saint Hilarius and Saint Felix,
yep,
the king gets rather perturbed, storms off, and a few weeks later writes Farmer Giles a letter that says, okay, here's the deal. We're going to go get that dragon's treasure, and because you're such a brave man, you're coming with.
Yeah, you're going to be leading the crusade, so to speak.
Right. So Giles, again, kind of finds himself bullied into the position of heroism, goes. They encounter the dragon kills many of the knights, but because of the shrewdness of Farmer Giles' horse, and because of his own shrewdness, he survives and ends up taking the dragon prisoner.
It's almost as if Farmer Giles, has a little bit more wit to him as the story progresses. Right. He's not as much of a pushover once, the dragon says, well, okay, I'll give you this much. And he says, no, I know you have more.
Well, even in the story, you find out at the very beginning that Giles is not someone you want to get into an argument with. He always wins. He's very stubborn.
Yeah, they mentioned that, not many people have ever won a bargain against Farmer Giles, and this dragon wasn't going to be one of those people.
Right. The dragon, not being a person, can't actually win this debate. So, since Farmer Giles has survived, he argues with the dragon, and he gets the dragon to bring out approximately 2/3 of its treasure. And because he's wise and he knows that you don't really push dragons into a corner if you can get away with it, he doesn't make the dragon take the rest of the treasure, or bring the rest of the treasure out. So they go back to Ham, and on the way back to Ham, Giles...
He loads up the dragon with all
the dragon
treasures.
carries the treasure back. And on the way...
Doesn't fly back.
No, he can't
Mind
fly
you,
'cause
he
it's too
tied
heavy.
his
Yeah.
wings are tied as well with the rope that he brought.
Right, that the parson made him bring.
Exactly.
So
Which he thought, he made a joke. What, do I need the rope? You know,
to commit
to
suicide.
hang myself?
So on the way back, Giles, being the captor of a dragon, finds his reputation significantly increased beyond what it was even after he shot a giant.
Yep.
So he ends up kind of acquiring something of a retinue. And the king eventually hears of this, that Giles has gone back to Ham with a retinue and is not coming back to the capital to give him the treasure, which is what he was supposed to do.
Now he is a knight now, in the sense of,
Well, I mean, he's kind of taken it for himself. Yeah. So the king gets all kinds of flustered, demands that Giles come back. Giles doesn't, and eventually the two have a showdown where the king is worsted because, you know, if your opponent has a pet dragon, you probably aren't going to win that confrontation. And eventually, as it turns out, Giles becomes king of the Little Kingdom, which follows the Middle Kingdom. And eventually the dragon goes, you know, Giles sends the dragon home. But this is the origin, according to Tolkien, the linguistic origins of the term, like of terms like Thames or the River Thames, is because that's one of Farmer Giles's titles. But that is a very brief synopsis. There's all kinds of wonderful storytelling and diction in this story. But since the discussion we're having today is what's wrong with the world, in the Middle Kingdom and in the beginning of the Little Kingdom,
yeah, we see
what's wrong.
We see a few things, and I guess maybe something we can touch on to paint a picture is maybe giving it more of a description of, you know, even Farmer Giles, what he looks like.
Yeah, go.
He's you know, he's a shorter, stockier farmer. He's got a big red beard, and he has his dog Garm. And we mentioned earlier, you know, his dog likes moonshine and rabbits, and he can, you know, be quite annoying sometimes. And if you read this short story, you'll see that when the giant shows up, Garm is screaming for help, trying to convince his owner, Farmer Giles, that, hey, there's something out there. I'm not just being an annoying dog.
Which he is an annoying dog, and honestly, he's kind of failing in his job because he is supposed to, as a farmer's dog, supposed to protect the herds and the land.
Yep.
Which is humorous because one of the things that you also see in the beginning of this story is Garm is really aggressive towards trespassers. Usually, he's got 3 different manners of speech. One that's that's aggressive and mean for trespassers. One that's very pretentious and obnoxious when he's talking to other dogs, and one that's very wheedling and sad and melancholy when he's talking to his master, which is pretty much the only dialogue you ever see.
The helpless.
Yeah, but despite being a large hound, he's a very large coward as well.
So he finally gets Farmer Giles' attention after Farmer Giles' wife, Agatha, I believe is her name, who is a very interesting character. We only hear about her, you know,
4 or 5 times.
4 or 5 times, and she's very aggravated with the dog. And she says, you know, if you truly believe what your dog's saying, then just go ahead and go out there and see what's going on. So he goes out there, like we mentioned. He finds the giant. He loads his blunderbuss. And another interesting fact about the blunderbuss is we notice that it's kind of a key element in the beginning of the story. And there's, you know, a lot of debate within the village inns, you know, in particular, whether or not this thing even works.
Because it hangs over his mantelpiece.
It sits there. It hasn't, I don't know if it's ever been used. We don't know if it's been used previously, but once it is used, that debate is ended. It works.
And Farmer Giles never has problems with trespassers ever again.
Exactly. So there's a little bit of, you know, we see this whole thing play out where the blunderbuss works. No more trespassers. He becomes a local hero, you know, a countryside hero, and the king hears about it, etc., etc. So, you know...
Interestingly, on the topic of tools being misplaced as well, we'll see this. The sword that is sent to Giles by the king.
You're better at pronouncing the name. It's from the knight Belamarius or Belamarius.
So this is a very, very ancient sword because it would allegedly come from the Roman occupation of Britain. So it's a very ancient sword. But it's sent to Giles because the king doesn't remember what it's for. It's been in his family for a long time, and he's like, yeah, well, I don't need this anymore. It's a sword that is no longer in the fashion of the court.
It's a showpiece.
Yeah, it's ancient. It's not a tool anymore.
It's also
So-
heavier than what they use
Right.
in
right.
these times.
So it's kind of this antique, and he thinks it's very quaint, and he thinks it would be kind of funny if he sends it to a farmer. He goes, oh yeah, this kind of brutish weapon will be appropriate for this uneducated idiot
Yep.
that styles himself a hero. So he sends this sword off, but it is, like we've said, a very ancient sword called Caudemorax, which roughly translates to tail biter. And that is a sword that has a very particular use for very particular times, which are...
Slaying dragons. And I think one of the interesting things is whenever it almost seems as if Farmer Giles doesn't even unsheath it, that it just comes out.
Oh, he never unsheaths it. It jumps out of
Yeah,
the sheath.
it jumps out, and it does what it's meant to do.
But it does that when dragons are near. So
Exactly. It says, I think they said if a dragon's within 2 miles
it's
or
either 2 or 5.
5 miles, something like that. It knows it has a duty, and whoever's wielding this sword also has a duty.
Right.
And we see that with the first interaction of Farmer Giles and the dragon, they're both shocked. Maybe you could describe that interaction.
Well, we've got to step back for a moment first, because one of the things that's really, really wrong with the world is people have forgotten what things are for, right? Like, people in the village kind of know that the blunderbuss is used to keep trespassers out, right?
Yeah.
Garm knows that his job is to guard the farm and to protect his master, even though he does it in a very, shall we say, less than brave way. But the king doesn't know what the sword's for anymore.
Yeah, so this little village has a sense of hierarchy,
Mm-hmm.
but
it has a
from
sense
the
of what
top,
its traditions are for. It
and-
knows that it has traditions.
but
of
from
what
the
they're
top
for.
down, there seems to be a lack of that.
Right, and it's not even that there's a lack of hierarchy or traditions anymore. The traditions have become so crystallized that no one knows what anything, or people have forgotten their place. So obviously, this being a medieval tale, there are knights, there are kings, right? We've already kind of discussed that. But one of the things that you see is every Michaelmas leading up to Christmas, a knight is supposed to go out, find a dragon, kill the dragon, and bring back the dragon's tail, and that is the crux of the feast.
And that's on the feast of Saint Nicholas Day.
Yeah, so
which is also
Christmas.
we see a few saints mentioned in this story. But yeah, as you were saying, on Saint Nicholas Day, a knight is set out.
But by the time of Farmer Giles, what's going on? Are they sending knights out to kill dragons?
No, now they've decided, to be a little bit lazier, and they have a baker who bakes a cake fashioned as a dragon's tail, and it's made out of
Spun sugar and almonds.
yeah, almond paste and spun sugar. And the people agree, and I can't, judge them on this, that I'm sure it tastes a lot better than an actual dragon's tail. But what we see is that tradition has been broken. There's no longer, the role of a knight being set out to do what he's supposed to do on this feast day. But instead we have a very sensitive chef. And they care, and you mentioned this before we hopped on here, that they care more about the chef's feelings than the tradition that, has been there for, who knows, hundreds of years prior to this.
Well, and the tradition has a purpose as well. That's one of the interesting things, too. It's not like the knight is supposed to go out and just... dragons aren't these tame creatures that are just chilling, and the knight's not just going out and killing some random creature. He's going out and killing a monster that exists for the purposes of embodying avarice and destruction.
Yeah.
Right? So the knight is supposed to be the extension of the extension of the king's arm. Right? He's supposed to go out, he's supposed to defend the kingdom from these monsters. And now they've kind of created their own little monster living in the castle kitchen that they're afraid to tick off, although what that has also led to is their own cowardice as well. Because one of the other things that we see is that there's, when the dragon, whose name is Chrysophylax, shows up, the knights don't want to go fight him because there's a tournament. Like, well, we've got this tournament that we have to fight in, and it would be really unfortunate if the Middle Kingdom lost prestige because our knights were out doing their job.
Yeah.
It's like, well, you're gonna play at war instead of going to war? You're not a page. You're not a young man. You're a knight. You're supposed to go fight. So In what other ways do we see the hierarchy being violated, other than tradition just not being understood to actually have practical applications?
Well, I guess what we see is that, Farmer Giles at the end, and we don't have to skip, all the way to the end, but we see him, progressively become the hero, and then, a knight. He eventually becomes a lord, and then a king. So we see, an establishment of a hierarchy, but we see that it's almost, I don't know how you would say it, like, I think we mentioned that it, above, the person from below ends up becoming the top guy.
Right. Well, you see that Giles fulfills his role within the hierarchy from the get-go, which is why he's able to ascend as high as he does.
He even calls out the king.
Well, he does call out the king later on, but initially what he does is his dog kind of does his job in a cowardly way and says, "Hey, there's a giant that just stepped on your favorite cow, and he's ruining your fields and he's destroying your hedges." And Farmer Giles goes, "Well, it's my land. I have to go protect it." So he goes and he protects his land. Right? He does what the king ought to be doing in a small scale, on a grand scale.
Yeah, exactly. He's taking the position of the king from the very beginning.
Well, he's being the king of his own house to begin with. But because the king refuses to do that later on...
He's not going to sit around and deal with property destruction and...
Right, well, because he's a
trespassers.
He's a curmudgeonly drunken farmer, unless we forget one of the great rewards that he receives
at the market
is after he chases off the giant, he gets boatloads of ale, which, according to the annals of the little kingdom, is almost enough to satisfy him.
Yeah, almost enough to float a boat.
But not quite enough.
So let's see. What else do you think we should touch on as far as that? We spoke about the blunderbuss and, the time period. What other connections can we make from this story to what we see, going on in society now, as far as tradition and hierarchy? Or what do you think you want to touch on a little bit more?
Well, when we forget purposes, when we forget what the purpose... let me rephrase. When hierarchies begin to dissolve, when traditions begin to dissolve, we see, to quote Pajot, the monsters begin to come in from the margins, and the two things then happen. They begin to destroy things, but then also the monsters being there begins to destroy them.
Yeah.
So one of the things that Ian referenced earlier was this whole idea that, dragons begin to think that knights are myths, which is a curious inversion, right? So,
yeah, I think they say something like, they're far and few and not to be feared.
Right. So in one passage, when the giant is spreading his rumors, it says, "The talk got louder. Lowland sheep and kine from the deep pastures were much discussed. The dragons pricked up their ears. They were hungry, and these rumors were attractive. So, knights are mythical," the younger and less experienced dragons said. "We always thought so. At least they may be getting rare," thought the older and wiser worms. "Far and few and no longer to be feared." So when you destroy a hierarchy, the monsters on the outside cannot be kept out.
They start to creep in.
Right. So maybe this is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but what we see in the modern world is this whole idea that because you don't go out and murder someone, right? I've never murdered someone. I've never actually stolen anything. I've never assaulted someone. I've never committed whatever crime. Therefore, I'm good. One, I would say that indicates a tremendous degree of ignorance of self.
Yeah.
You do not know yourself if you think you're not capable of those things. But
have you thought about it, though?
Well, when you take away, a confessional society, right? And this is one thing that I will say for Protestants in the early years of American history, they were really confessional. You don't get to pretend like you're not doing things. You don't get to do things in secret, right? That's kind of the premise of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter.
Yep.
The things done in secret are brought into the light, and consequences will be dealt, or will be had at least. And that is kind of what you see happening in Farmer Giles, right? Is knights no longer go out and kill dragons. Therefore, dragons think that knights don't exist. So dragons come and ravage the land.
Yep. And then you have this farmer
who has to then step into the breach.
who probably does know, who has no doubt in his mind that these animals exist. You know, they don't mention that, but I'm sure he's not like the knights who are, you know, too preoccupied with their games to even think about this situation unfolding.
Right. And I wouldn't even go so far as
He's
to
living
say
a
that-
traditional life.
Right. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Giles necessarily thinks that dragons exist, but he's not making excuses as to why he can't do his jobs. Like, one of the reasons that he provides that he doesn't want to go fight Chrysophylax in the initial part of the story is because it's not his job, and technically speaking, that's true. You know, he's a farmer. He is not supposed to be the dragon slayer.
So to speak, he's at the bottom of the totem pole.
Right. I mean, Garm is obviously a shade lower, but that's for a number of reasons, not just the fact that he's a dog. He's also a worthless dog.
Well, not so worthless, right? It's
yeah.
funny also because Farmer Giles doesn't even mention, you know, hey, my dog alerted me.
Right.
But the dog walks around, you know, kind of high and mighty after this. Like, he knows in his own head he's also a hero. It doesn't need to be said.
Right.
But
well, he's under the impression that he's a hero no matter what he does.
Yeah. He's a dog.
He's a coward throughout the entire thing, and he still thinks that he's a hero, which is why the other dogs find him so insufferable. But where were we going with that? The
dissolution of, you know,
right.
of a hierarchy and
right.
tradition. Things start to creep in that shouldn't.
Right. But eventually, what has to happen? Like, a hierarchy can't remain disordered. That's that's, I would say, the main thrust of what the story of Farmer Giles is kind of touching on, in my opinion. The fact that the king is so bad. So before I trash talk the king too much, King Augustus, I will say that he is not a coward. You know, when he is faced with Farmer Giles with his tame dragon, he doesn't run away.
Yeah.
His knights run away, his men-at-arms run away, his horse runs away.
His horse gets scratched.
And runs away, but he comes back. So he's not a coward. But that doesn't mean that he's fit to be the king. Because he cannot lead, he cannot see past himself.
He very quickly realizes that too.
Yeah. He experiences that, but I don't think he ever realizes that.
Yeah. He's still angry
Yeah.
after the fact, but Farmer Giles sends him gifts until
he becomes a prince. Then he stops sending him tribute.
So he sends him tribute on the day that they met at the bridge.
The feast of Saint Matthias.
Yeah.
But the way you see that this hierarchy eventually has to be filled is, so anyone who's familiar with medieval manuscripts, and especially with the modern medieval fantasy that's put out, most of which is garbage, is that members of the royalty always refer to themselves with the royal we. Right, so they won't say, "I, the king, decree whatever." They'll say, "I, the king, decree insert thing, random thing here." So there's this great dialogue that the farmer and the king are having, and it's in front of the entire town and in front of the king's entire army. And the king wants the sword Tailbiter back because he realizes it's the mechanism by which Giles has been able to
gather all of this nobility and wealth.
Well, to ascend as far above his station as he has. And
he's got some sort of stature now.
Right. Because the king sent him this sword. So the king gets, they're going back and forth, and as we mentioned earlier, the one person in the entire kingdom you don't want to get into an argument with is Giles, because he is so belligerent when it comes to arguing. He will not give if he doesn't want to give. So they go back and forth, and eventually the king becomes extremely angry. And he says, he forgets his royal we and says, "Give me my sword." And Farmer Giles responds with, "Give us your crown." So he takes, that is the point when he actually steps above his station, right? Because up until now, he's just been kind of belligerent. But at this point, he's saying, you are not worthy of being he's not even saying you're not worthy of being the king, but he's speaking to the king as a superior.
Yeah, he's definitely poking him a bit.
Well, he's not even poking him a bit. He is tacitly assuming the role of the king's lord.
Yeah, give me your crown.
Give us your sword. Such a great line. What else is wrong with the world?
In our world or in this world?
Oh, in this world. There's still plenty we can discuss here.
Oh, let's see. I don't know. You're a little bit more familiar with the story. I just read it last night and today, but let me think. I think what's also interesting is that once Farmer Giles, obtains this status, he starts to rebuild the hierarchy.
How does he do that?
We see him giving out positions to, I think he makes the miller an undertaker.
No. The blacksmith becomes the
undertaker. Blacksmith becomes an undertaker, and for people who don't know what an undertaker is, maybe you could explain. It's someone who deals with corpses.
Someone who prepares the dead for burial.
So he went from one. I mean, I don't know if a blacksmith is a bad job, but he's not really moving up.
Well, he kind of is, actually. He's actually moving in his appropriate station, because the blacksmith is... I mean, for anyone who doesn't use the humoral mode of determining emotions, you've got choler, melancholy, sanguinity, and I can never remember the third one, or the fourth one. But the blacksmith is extremely melancholy. He's always making these very unpleasant predictions. One of the things that's said of him is that he predicts bad things happening almost on a daily basis. So he's kind of this dark prophet. Yeah,
there was a point where the dog was when Farmer Giles went to find the dragon, the dog stayed behind, and he was yelping and screaming, and I think the blacksmith said, well, there's our sign. So yeah, you're right. He's got this very melancholy attitude about everything, and
so becoming an undertaker is kind of him moving into his proper role.
Yeah,
that's what he's good at.
He's
that's
dead
what
inside.
He likes to do. Well, he's not even dead inside. He just doesn't see the silver lining.
And then I think the miller
becomes,
which for people who don't understand what a miller is,
just someone who grinds grain effectively. He's the one who prepares the village's grain to be baked into bread.
So Farmer Giles, after taming the dragon and getting all the riches, he turns the blacksmith into an undertaker, the miller
becomes eventually a servant of the crown. So he actually moves up.
He's like the right hand man almost.
No. He's certainly not the right hand man, but he receives a lot of good from that. He's a he has a state sponsored position.
And then the parson, who is like we've said before, a pastor or a priest, he becomes a bishop. So during all of this stuff that's going on, we see that Farmer Giles, once he obtains status, he starts, giving positions to people in a proper way, and we see the hierarchy being rebuilt. So I always thought that was pretty interesting as well.
Well, and he also makes a new body of knights. So he goes to this village, and there's a bunch of on his way back from capturing Chrysophylax.
He picks like the best 12, I think.
Yeah, he comes into this village, and they're so happy that the village is giving him free food and free beer, which, as we know, the farmer is quite fond of. And so there's a bunch of young men in the town that say, okay, we really want to come with you. We want to help you. And he says, okay. And he looks at him, and he finds the 12, and they're referred to as the 12 likely lads. So they're the ones who are loyal and they're brave. And so they become the new core of knights, and they earn that status by guarding the dragon. So they're braver.
Who he kept in his barn.
Well, in the tithe barn of Ham. But the knighthood of the Middle Kingdom is reinvigorated. They're no longer peacocks that only care about playing at war. They're actually brave enough to be the masters of a dragon, which is why they end up with the dragon emblem as their sign. That actually becomes the flag that delineates that is used as the symbol of the Little Kingdom, which, for anyone who knows anything about what British, or I won't say British, flags in the UK look like depending on location, the Welsh flag is a red dragon.
Yep. So we see the hierarchy being reestablished. We see tradition being reestablished. what else do you think we can draw from this before we dive into, a little bit
wrong with the world?
what's wrong with the world? And I know we're also going to read about an Orthodox saint and pull some stuff from that as well that coincides with this topic as well. But before we do that, what do you think? What else would you say in this story is wrong with the world? Obviously, we've touched on the hierarchy and tradition quite a bit, but is there anything that maybe most people might overlook, or something that I didn't see? I know you've read this story quite a few times.
I've read it 5 or 6 times.
But I mean, we could even talk about how the giant not having friends, because of his stupidity, deafness, and the scarcity of giants. So there's little things like that. I'm not sure if that's exactly relevant, but the mention of saints,
Well, it's definitely happening in a Christian milieu. But one of the things that I think we ought to discuss is the first meeting between Giles and Chrysophilax. So when they first meet up, Chrysophilax kind of knows that he wants to kill and eat Giles because he's previously eaten the parson of an adjacent village, and because the parson was so stringy and nasty and lean, he gave the dragon heartburn. So
yeah, we see them. They meet and say, "Good morning," said the dragon. "You seem surprised." "Good morning," said Giles. "I am that." "Excuse me," said the dragon. He had cocked a very suspicious ear when he caught the sound of rings jingling as the farmer fell. "Excuse my asking, but were you looking for me, by any chance?" "No, indeed," said the farmer. "Who'd have thought of seeing you here? I was just going for a ride."
So what you see here is kind of this. I mean, obviously, it's a very atypical interaction between a knight and a dragon, or between even a person and a dragon. That's not how we typically think of them happening. It's just a cordial greeting, and then wait a minute, you might be you might be something other than what you appear to be.
I hear a noise that sounds
like you might be a knight. You're pretending to be a farmer.
He's got this inherent, he knows what's going on. They're both playing stupid.
Right, they're both playing stupid, and like I said, Chrysophilax wants to kill and eat Giles because he's kind of hungry because he's been sleeping for a few days.
And he's been eating skinny priests.
Yeah, skinny parsons. But what's really interesting here is the subtext is neither of them they both have this awareness that they're engaging in an ancient ritual, but they're not really sure what to do, because Giles is playing at being a knight,
but he's also got his chainmail covered, his knight's helmet covered by a hat.
Right.
Because he doesn't want the dragon to know he's there for him.
Well, he's acting in self-preservation. He doesn't want to die. But he's not sure what he ought to do. And the thing that kind of elucidates things for him is Chrysophilax notices that he dropped something because his horse bucks him off. And the dragon's going, okay, well, I'm gonna try to distract him so I can kill him.
He goes, I think you dropped something.
He goes, you dropped something. And Giles turns around and goes, oh, yes, I did. And he picks up the sword, Tailbiter.
An ancient trick.
Right. Which Chrysophilax recognizes, and that kind of tames him. It starts to tame him, at least. It starts the process. And what I would take from that is that when you've lost your traditions, when you no longer know what they are, ritual and sacred objects can help you find those again. Because by getting a hold of Tailbiter again, like when you read the story, Giles never really actually does anything with the sword other than hold it.
Yeah, the sword does what it's meant to do.
Yeah, the sword tries to hit Chrysophilax, and at one point succeeds and actually hurts him badly enough to prevent him from flying. The sword takes random swings at him.
That was in their first encounter, right?
Yeah. Giles just happens to be holding it, and that's not unimportant. But one of the things that we can do, kind of moving in the direction, I think, of what's wrong with the world today, is recognize that interacting and engaging with ancient sacred things can pull us back in the appropriate direction, can pull us back towards the reestablishment of appropriate hierarchies. I don't know. What do you think of that, Ian? Am I completely talking trash? Or...
No, I agree. Just just like you said, being in touch with ancient traditions, which we find, every time we're at a liturgy or just being involved in the Orthodox faith, it brings us closer to home, I would say, But yeah, I agree completely.
Right. The liturgy puts us in touch with, or places us in the midst of the heavenly host, and it places us in touch with the Church Triumphant, which for anyone who is not Orthodox that's listening, what in the Orthodox Church we have two tiers of Christians, for lack of a better term. The members of the Church Militant, which are those of us who are still alive and who are still seeking the kingdom of God on earth, and those who have reposed in victory. So the saints, the choir of the saints, maybe in somewhat Catholic terminology.
Martyrs.
Right. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to think of what to say about that, but it's also odd that we see, a lot of people in the Western world feel like there is no tradition, and there's kind of like this whole revival lately. We had the Tradcaths and the, I'm not a big fan of this word, but the Ortho Bros, and although some of that stuff can be, a little toxic, I at least, noticed that there's a little bit of a revival of traditionalism. And a lot of people think that has been lost, but what it is we're removed so far from God that we can't even see that it's still there.
Well, we've decided that we know best.
Yeah.
So this kind of brings us to our next topic, which is, we've kind of discussed what's broken in Farmer Giles of Ham and given a very broken synopsis. But what about us? What can Farmer Giles teach us about what's broken in our world? And Ian's already discussed this idea that the hierarchy is obviously backwards, and there are people trying to rediscover it, maybe not in the healthiest ways, but they're seeking after it.
I think something we can learn from him is just living a traditional life.
What would that entail, you think?
I mean, from his perspective, he's kind of just doing his own thing. Nothing's changed for him. He's just on a farm with his dog and his wife.
Would you say he's doing his own thing, or he's doing what he was raised to do, and what his position necessitates that he do?
Yeah, I don't think for him tradition has been broken.
Well, it hasn't. It hasn't been.
Yeah, and that's why he's able to, be called to this position and execute it in the manner he did. Although it might have been, under the influence of a few ales, he still...
Whatever it takes to get you there.
Yeah, he still did, what he should do and what he was meant to do. Maybe he wasn't tainted by... You could say that the Middle Kingdom could be an example of the modern world. They've lost touch with everything else.
The symbols have all become nothing but symbols.
Exactly. We used to go out and hunt dragons for the tail. Now we'll just bake a tail. And it's kind of what we see now. We used to, and I'm guilty of this as well, and we all are because of the situations we're in, but we used to go out and hunt chickens, and now we just drive to Safeway and we buy a rotisserie chicken out of ease. It's just, little things like that where we're lacking tradition as far as just growing our own food.
But Ian, getting your own food, or getting up and doing your prayers before you have a cup of coffee and all that stuff, it's hard.
Yeah, it is.
Hunting a dragon is hard. Baking a dragon's tail
is easy.
It's pretty easy.
Yeah, it's true.
So I mean, would you say that? Let me rephrase. Obviously, the easy thing is not in and of itself virtuous, but neither is it in and of itself evil.
Yeah, good point. But which one brings us closer to God?
Does that depend on the act itself or on the man?
I guess that's also another question. But I think what I'm trying to say is that we choose to take the easy road, obviously. Just in society in general, or we shorten everything. We wake up and I'm guilty of this. We wake up and we say a smaller prayer than we should, just because we're ready to get on our phone, or we're ready to do whatever it may be.
So how is that the personal scale, I'll say personal because the idea of the term individual is one that I find thoroughly distasteful, and as we'll get into in some other podcast, I don't think that individuals actually exist. I don't think there's such a thing. But how do we go from that personal praxis? What do we do with that personal praxis on a grand scale? You know, so obviously we each have individual things wrong, which answers the question of what's wrong with the world in a G.K. Chesterton style, which is I am.
Yeah.
If every person looked in the mirror and said, I am the reason that the bad things happen in the world, and they sought then to reform their lives in light of that, then the world would be fixed.
As a collective, if every individual in the collectiveness realized that they are what's wrong.
Well, that would fix the world in a political sense, and in a materialist 21st or 20th or 21st century sense. But the reason that the saints are because they woke up one day and by the grace of God and by seeking that, realized that that was the case and acted as though that were the case.
Yeah. I think to touch on that, I was at a service for the Myrrh streaming icon, the Softener of Evil Hearts, and they had two priests there. One was Romanian, one was Rokor, and the Rokor, after the Romanian gave his homily, the Rokor priest came out and talked and kind of touched on that. You know, we're dealing with what we're dealing with because of our sins as a collective. People, if you know, we have the Orthodox Church and we have the monastics praying for everybody, and we pray for people during liturgy and, you know, during our own prayer life, but there's a lack of people doing that in general. People aren't repenting on a grand scale. So, you know, we're suffering because of that as a whole.
Yeah, well, I definitely wouldn't disagree with that, but we also so there's a great poem. We'll go in the medieval direction for a moment, maybe for longer than a moment. There's a wonderful poem out there. I'm wanting to say it was written in the 14th century. Don't quote me on that, but it's called Pearl, and it's about a man sitting on the grave of his daughter, lamenting the fact that she has died. And for a number of reasons that maybe we'll get into in a different podcast, that is something that's very poignant to me. I imagine there are a lot of people out there for whom that is the case. Well, not I imagine, I know there are a lot of people out there for whom that is the case. But he's sitting on the grave of his daughter lamenting her death. And he is granted a beatific vision of her in paradise. And they have a conversation. And one of the things that she says to him is it's very ecclesiastical, in the sense of the book of Ecclesiastes. And she says something to the effect of, you know, you cannot question God for the cross that he gives you. What he wants from you is devoted service through your life. And you can't question him for this. If you must submit to it and rejoice in everything that he says and that he allows to happen.
We all have a cross to bear, whether or not we choose it.
Yeah, it's a very heartrending poem, but it's a wonderful poem. I think everyone ought to read it. But that, well, and I suppose I say that with regard to almost everything. But with everything that I read, with a handful of exceptions, there's definitely a few books I would say no one ought to ever read, and they should all be removed from the recollection of men. But I don't think that about many things, contrary to what some would say. But yeah, so actually Ian's just pulled the poem up real fast, I think, and
if I can get it.
The last, oh, if not, it doesn't matter. But going to a grander scale, though, I know we promised to talk about the medieval worldview, and I'll preface this by saying that, while I have a great love for the medieval world, I am not as widely read as I would like to be, although I am working on that. But one of the books that everyone ought to read to learn more about the medieval model is a book called The Discarded Image, which is a series of lectures that C.S. Lewis gave that were written down, that were transcribed. And with a few exceptions, he does a really good job kind of expressing the medieval model. But one of the things that you kind of note in that is that, and this is something you'll note in any medieval text that you read, theology and seeking a life of holiness are the most important things that one can do, right? So there's a phrase, I forget where it comes from, but the defining aspect of the medieval university and medieval education as a rule was the idea that theology is the queen of the sciences. So if you want to go study the natural sciences, right? So what we would now call biology or something like that, or astronomy, the first thing you do is you become very familiar with the scriptures. Now that leads to problems. You know, we see that in the Galileo affair when Galileo decides that because he's studied theology that he has the right to act as a theologian, which he doesn't.
Yeah.
And he was actually very...
We see that online in the online Orthodox community too.
Right. Well, you see that anywhere that people have access to knowledge.
Yeah.
But when theology ceases to be the lens through which you perceive the world,
Everything.
it has to go to chaos. There's no way it can't.
Yeah, I think we talked about Genesis 1.
Yeah. Do you care to relate that?
I do care.
You had some good insights there.
Did I? I don't remember that. I don't. I know we were going to talk about Saint Winifred as well, which was a conversation we had prior to going live, and I think that's where we started talking about Genesis 1 and how God created order out of chaos.
So Saint Winifred will be the end cap to this then, if that's where we're going to go, I
Okay.
suppose. But yeah, so Genesis 1,
We see God create order out of chaos.
right, which is something that if anyone who is listening has any familiarity with other creation myths, that's generally what happens as well.
It's kind of symbolic of baptism.
That it is,
God,
and
you know,
just the Christian life in general.
Yeah, creating chaos or order out of chaos, which we're chaotic beings. We're not meant to be, but because of the fall, we've become quite chaotic. You know,
well, we've become tainted by chaos. We're not.
Yeah.
We're not
inherently chaotic beings.
Not in the way that demons are now.
Yeah.
But
that'll be a fun stream.
I'm always reticent to discuss that. So in Genesis 1, God creates order out of chaos, which is something that is pretty universal in every creation myth that I'm familiar with. But you know, a lot of Greco or Greek or Roman or Near Eastern or even Native American, although I'm somewhat less familiar with those. These stories all have order being created out of chaos. And one of the interesting things you see happen in books or in texts like the Poetic Edda from Snorri Sturluson is he, in the 13th century or 14th century, he retells the Norse creation sagas with the addition that, oh yeah, but God creates everything first. He created Genesis. He created the Garden of Eden. He created man and woman. And then creation fell. And that's where you get all of this insanity from. So when... all that to say, like I alluded to earlier, when you remove theology, that lens of Genesis, that lens of the Bible, and interpreting through sacred scripture, when you remove that from the acquisition of knowledge, we necessarily fall into chaos. So,
which leads to
all kinds of fun things.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you see, and to anyone who's listened to Lord of Spirits or any of the stuff from Father Stephen DeYoung and Father Andrew Damick, and even Father Peter Hears and some of these other Orthodox podcasters, these priests, one of the things that they'll note is, how shall I say, technology, unfettered technological advancement, and just unfettered knowledge creates demonic people. Right? And I don't mean that in the way that, if you have an iPhone, you're possessed by a demon or you're going to become a bad person. Although that can be the outcome, because iPhones and phones in general have created this access to things that, one, should never have been made, but two, them being made, we ought not have access.
Yeah. They're there, but it doesn't mean we should see it.
Right. Or hear it or whatever. And that's what you see in the Book of Enoch and some other Second Temple Jewish texts, as well as if you look very closely in the Old Testament, you see that that's what unfettered technological access does. And it's interesting to note, I think, that a lot of the modern technology that we see in the world was not obtained during a Christian age. I know people like Rodney Stark, who is a phenomenal researcher. I recommend everyone read his books. He's a great author. But it's one of the things that he kind of fails to note, because he reads the Middle Ages as this time period when the groundwork was laid for the modern age, and when we can have all this technology. We can have the printing press, we can have books, we can have medical science, we can have biology, we can have all this great art and architecture and things like that. And he's not wrong, but he reads it in a materialistic way, which means that he can only view those things as good.
Yeah. I think also I was just looking this up, and the Greek word of, the etymology of the word technology comes from two Greek words, techne and logos. And techne means art, skill, craft, or the way, manner, or means by which a thing is gained. So literally, technology means words or discourse about the way things are gained. So technology isn't, inherently bad. It's
Right.
how we choose to use it.
Well, it's how it's gained too. That matters. I think. So.
Yeah, it leads to psychological and, even physical issues in some cases.
Right. And one of my favorite story for explaining why the way in which technology is gained matters, and you can tell whether or not it's a good technology to some extent by the way it was obtained, is the way that first nuclear reaction was discovered. And that is Fermi and a bunch of these other physicists that were working with him, and I believe it was in the early 30s or the late 20s, I don't remember. They, in the gymnasium of a university in the middle of Chicago, started a nuclear chain reaction with a bunch of radioactive material, not knowing what it was going to do. Thank God Chicago, well, depending on where you said, but thank God Chicago is not a smoldering nuclear wasteland at the moment. But Fermi and his co-workers were extraordinarily irresponsible. And that, in and of itself, indicates, whatever other goods the nuclear tech has done for us, which I'm not going to say that there aren't goods that have come from it. The origins of that, I think, taint the entire thing.
Yeah. And we even see that we were talking about the Book of Genesis, the Tower of Babel.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just doing a little research on the side here about this, and it says, the well-known story of the Tower of Babel from the Book of Genesis also serves as a backdrop in discussions related to scientific and the creation of new technology, engineering, and hubris. Of course, there's nothing wrong with invention. For the faithful, the creative genius is a gift from God to be nurtured, to be used to sustain and enhance life. It becomes a significant matter, however, if humans or animals in the process of technological innovation at invention are misused for experimental purposes or not shown proper respect. So, that's right. Kind of something that we were touching on as well.
Well, that's one of the things. There's been a fairly recent story that I won't say it rocked the American media, but it definitely perturbed a few people in America, because, here we have a lot of people that think that animals are roughly equivalent to people, which is disconcerting. But that story that came out about I believe it was the NIH.
The beagles?
Right. They did a lot of just really cruel and unnecessary testing on these small animals.
For the benefit of quote-unquote science.
Well, but the problem is it didn't benefit anyone or anything. The things that they were testing were things that we already knew, right? It was kind of an exercise in sadism, or that's how it sounds. Now, I'm going to echo some Catholic commentators and say that I don't really care that the Beagles were tortured on an or not even on face value. I don't care. I don't really have any great fondness for animals. That's not to say I hate them, but they exist, whatever. But
that's one thing we disagree on,
right?
But that's fine.
But I am in no way, shape, or form okay with anyone torturing something for this for any reason. I'm really not okay with torture at all.
What about for science, bro?
But the problem I do have with this experiment, what I think it tells us, is that the men and women who were involved in those experiments have no business doing any kind of scientific inquiry because they are moral monsters.
Do you think they prayed before they did this?
Well, if they did, I don't want to know who or what they prayed to.
Exactly. They have no morals, whether or not what they did, if you care or not, or if you agree with it, you can just tell off the bat. There's no morality in that. And that's the thing.
Right. Well, it speaks to a catastrophic lack of moral sense on their part.
Yeah. Wondering how we can tie that into Farm of Giles.
That's a symptom of a disordered world.
Yeah, it is. No morality, no tradition, no hierarchy, no morality. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's all about me. And we see that right now, self-worship. And our spiritual father talks about self-esteem a lot. He cannot stand the word self-esteem because the only thing we should be giving esteem to is God. Once we start thinking about ourselves, then...
Well, we ought to esteem others and God.
Yeah.
And the problem with self-esteem, I think, is that and I don't think this is what it was intended to do, because I definitely don't think that people should be engaging in mental self-flagellation. That is not wise. But I also don't think that people ought to think highly of themselves because they exist.
Yeah, I was listening to David Patrick Harry last night, and someone sent him a super chat. I can't remember the exact quote, but, I think there's 2 lies the devils tell you. One is that you're a saint, and one is that you cannot be saved.
Right. Well, both of them are equally dangerous.
Exactly. And
although one of them is far more insidious than the other, I think.
Yeah. So, I think that's good. Maybe we can start to touch on a little bit about Saint Winifred, or do you think?
Well, let's go with Saint Winifred, and then maybe if anyone who's listening has any questions, they can ask them in the chat, and we can try to address them.
We've had quite a few people go in and out, so I appreciate everybody that's been with us this long. Everybody that has spoken in the chat, tuned in. Make sure you like, subscribe, share this, and we are going to continue on with the stream. So Nathan brought up a story about Saint Winifred and her Holy Spring, and this is a saint in the Orthodox Church who we commemorate on, I think it's March 16th.
No, November 3rd.
November 3rd.
November 3rd.
Yeah, and the 16th.
Gregorian calendar, November 16th
on the Julian calendar.
And she's a Welsh saint.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and put this in the chat as well if anybody wants to just read along. We're only going to read a little bit about it, and then we're going to touch on how this ties into our conversation on chaos and what's wrong with the world and everything we've been speaking on. Anything else that you want to say, Nathan, before I read this?
No, sir. I've already said probably far more than anyone wanted to hear.
Well, I appreciate it. All right, so Saint Winifred, whose name in her own language was Winifred, was born in North Wales in the early 7th century when Christendom was still whole and many great saints were living on the British Isles. She was of noble lineage, a descendant of the early Welsh kings of Powys, and the only daughter of Tiffod, lord of the townships of Trefenion, later named Holywell, Mainwen, and Gwyffinon. Gotta love these names. Tegango?
That's good enough. My Welsh pronunciation is fairly bad. I can finish part of that if you'd like, since there's some really, really good
Yeah.
jaw crackers in there. Her mother's brother was Saint Bueno, abbot of Clynogvar and Gwynedd. After difficulties he had encountered from the local princes of Clynog, Saint Bueno sought refuge with his sister's family and thus received land from her husband Tivid. From an early age, Winifred was instructed in the spiritual life by her uncle, and her sole desire was to dedicate herself to God and become a nun. She lived under the saint's care near a chapel he had built in her native town. One Sunday, while St. Bueno was serving the liturgy at the church, Winifred was alone in her house. A prince named Caradog was riding by and stopped at the house to ask for a drink of water. Winifred was very beautiful, and Caradog was stricken with a desire to have her in marriage. The maiden's resolve to preserve her virginity and become a nun was unshakable, however, so the prince attempted to take her by force. Winifred struggled free and ran toward the church, but Caradog soon caught up with her on his horse. Out of anger at the refusal, he struck off her head with his sword. Her severed head rolled down the hillside to the churchyard. When her uncle and congregation, which probably included some of her other kin, saw what had happened, they were horrified. The wicked Caradog fell dead on the spot. A spring of healing water sprang forth at the place where St. Winifred's head fell. St. Bueno took Winifred's head and replaced it on her body, and then prayed to God that she be restored whole. By the saint's prayers, Winifred came back to life. The two then sat on a rock, which was later named St. Bueno's Rock, and her uncle told her that anyone seeking help through her prayers at that spot would find it. And a red mark remained forever around her neck as a remnant of her miraculous restoration. And so the story then continues. She founded a monastery and engaged helped in some local councils, and eventually reposed eventually reposed at the site of her monastery in Holywell. But her head is still reputed to be there and is still a site of pilgrimage, which I would highly recommend people go check it out. A little bit of an autobiographical side note for a moment. One of the reasons I have a fondness for St. Winifred is because I lived in Wales for a little while in a little town, well, not a little town, but in a town called Swansea, which, because everything is smaller in the UK, I wasn't all that far from where her relics are. And actually, that's where my patron saint is as well, Saint David. Saint David of Wales, who's the patron of that country. So I have a bit of a devotion to the Welsh and British saints. But
We have someone in the chat. His name is Papa Stephanos. He's been supporting the channel for a little bit. He says Paus is Wales. I believe he's in the UK. Papa Stephanos, if you're in here, go ahead and drop a comment and let us know where you're at. I appreciate you supporting the channel. I know you're in the UK somewhere. We've spoke
and criticize our
few
pronunciation if it suits you. Ian, so what do you think about what have you got for us with this story? This is quite a wonderful hagiography, and I know a lot of Protestants tend to be horrified by these kinds of things, and I know I was one. I was a Protestant. This kind of thing really bothered me, but it's a phenomenal story.
Yeah. So one of the things that I find interesting about this is the fact that she just wanted to preserve her virginity and and serve Christ, and it seemed like that that bothered somebody, and I think we see that in society as well. People, Orthodox Christians or Christians in general, we just want to serve Christ to the best of our ability, and society seems to to demonize us for that.
Yeah, well, the order in which we ought to keep the world, the way our world ought to be ordered, shall I say, is certainly not that of, does not reflect what the secular mindset is. And I mean, that's not to cast stones from on high, because certainly my life does not reflect the order, the appropriate order of loves that St. Winifred's life reflects. But what do you think of Caradog killing someone who loved God so much she just refused him marriage?
Well, I think that turnaround, it didn't work out too well for him, to say the least. I think, did they mention it in this that the earth ate him?
That's in some of the hagiographies I've read. It wasn't in this one, but there's one or two that I've come across where immediately upon beheading the saint, the earth opens up and swallows Caradog. Like, no one knows. It's not that he just fell dead or that another member of Winifred's family got angry and killed him, the earth itself was so appalled at his godlessness that
Yeah.
it killed him, which is an interesting take on Saint Paul, saying that even creation itself, the entirety of creation, groans for the unveiling of the sons of God.
Yeah. Let's see. So, what else about Saint Winifred that we can tie into this?
I mean, we've already kind of touched on it, but her story, I could see someone reading her story, especially someone who is not familiar with the fact that within Orthodoxy, and just church tradition in general, I know the Roman Catholics still have this to a degree, that marriage is not bad. The problem here is not that Caradog wanted to marry Winifred, right? And it's not that
It was her desire to serve Christ.
well, and there's one of the things that I think we can say about Caradog is that his motivation was lust. So he had a problem. But Saint Winifred is not treating marriage badly in this. She does not hate marriage. She just has, I say just like it's a trite thing. Her love for Christ is so great that she does not wish to place herself in holy matrimony, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. There's another British saint, Saint Brigid of Kildare. So Irish, actually. British isn't quite accurate there. But she was beautiful and she had many suitors, and she was so upset with that I don't remember if she prayed to God that he would strike her with ugliness, so that people would leave her alone and she could devote herself to a monastic life, or if it was that she actually physically defaced herself. I don't remember which of the two it was, but much in the same way that Saint Benedict was relieved of the temptations to lust by stripping naked and jumping into a rose bush, that act of dedication to Christ, that desire, that burning desire to serve Christ, and to have victory over the passions, was rewarded.
Yeah, we see that a lot with, stories of the martyrs.
Mm-hmm. And we see it a lot with British saints. We see it with Saint Winifred. Like, her desire to serve God is so great that God gives her life again.
Yeah.
That she can continue living that life. Saint Brigid has the same thing.
I think her relics are in Shrewsbury.
I don't know where Saint Brigid's are.
Or no, Saint Winifred. I think that her relics were translated to an ornate shrine in Shrewsbury.
Nice.
Which I'm not.
That's still in Wales.
Yeah, so somewhere in Wales as well.
Yeah, and one of the things you'll see in the hagiography later on is if you go to Holywell, the stream or the spring that sprang up where she was martyred has never run dry, no matter if it's drought or otherwise, and the stones in the bottom still seem to be blood-stained, and it's still, and there's actually, there's naturally a scientific explanation for why the ground there still smells sweet. They blame it on a particular genus of or species of moss, but either way, that's 1,500 years after the fact. We're still looking at a holy site where a woman who had her loves ordered, reposed, was granted life again, and then eventually reposed later after many years serving God, which is a beautiful story.
Yeah, I have never heard of Saint Winifred, so I'm glad that
The lives of the Welsh saints are something else. I know that's something that hopefully Pajot and Roland will eventually end up talking about.
Well, if not, something we can definitely talk about. So let's see, are we going to do any book recommendations or maybe a little wrap up? And
book recommendations? Ian, do you have anything for us book-wise?
I think everybody obviously should read the Farmer Giles of Ham. And I think you mentioned a C.S. Lewis book.
Right, that's the one I mentioned earlier, but it's called, for anyone who either has forgotten or wasn't in the chat at the time, it's called The Discarded Image. It's definitely not a 15-minute read, but if you want a really good introduction to the medieval model, that's a really good place to start. And then I would highly recommend going to Richard Rowland's blog, which is called Blog on the Barrow Downs. He has some good reflections on Tolkien and Lewis and the medieval model, and how Lewis, while he was right in many things, because he was a Protestant and didn't have an appropriate view of, didn't have I won't say appropriate, because he didn't have a proper view of the counsel of God and the saints and the role that their intercession plays for us. He wasn't quite able to come up with that picture in the way that it ought to be painted.
Okay, and then I think, I don't know if there will be a part 2 of this specific book. I'm pretty sure we covered all the bases on that, but we're going to do a few episodes on what's wrong with the world. Do we have anything we can tell our guests about the next episode, potentially?
The next episode, I think maybe we can look at Antigone a little bit, but we don't necessarily have to go into that, because I think Farmer Giles of Ham really paints a pretty tight picture of how it looks, and we don't have to go too in depth there. But we can discuss Antigone a little bit, and maybe we'll discuss Solzhenitsyn's observation that the line between good and evil goes directly through the human heart. And I think one way of looking at that will be through his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. So maybe we'll look at that.
All right. Well, if anybody has any super chats or any questions, you go ahead and drop them in the comments. And make sure to like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Road to Paradise. Hopefully it was entertaining and edifying, and that you learned something. I know I definitely did. Nathan's always got a lot of knowledge to spread. I'm very grateful for that. I threw a couple links in the chat as well for the PDF version of Farmer Giles of Ham, the book that we mentioned, the C.S. Lewis book, and Blog on the Barrow Downs by Richard Rowland. That's his blog as well. Anything else you think we can touch on?
No, I don't have anything else. I think I've probably spoken far more than was appropriate.
No, I think it was great. Okay, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and sign off. And if anybody wants to support the channel, there is a super chat link in the description. Feel free to donate. Make sure to share, like, subscribe, and we will see you maybe later this week, if not next week, for episode 3.
God go with you all.
God bless you guys.